We're going to talk about the ebook accessibility audit. Thank you.
Thank you. All good?
Yep.
Can you hear us? Well, yeah, we can. That was fascinating, David. I'm actually going to go to Florence in a few weeks' time. I'm looking forward to fainting. I didn't realise that. It's a beautiful place. That I can understand that. As is this a beautiful place, even with these bright lights. I've been set up with one of these. I was given the choice of standing at this thing, which I usually, if I stand at one of these, I normally knock it over. So as I had the opportunity to wear this, I thought I'd take it up because I'm actually ticking off a bucket list item. Not to be at Dawson Day, although I'm very, very pleased to be invited. But in 1973, one of my heroes stood here and gave a speech. Granted, he had a marmoset, but it was David Attenborough. Gave a talk here. There's wonderful pictures on the interweb. If you want to look it up, just put in David Attenborough Royal Institution. He's very young, he's very good looking, and he has a very nice voice, so I apologise in advance. So thank you for giving me the chance to tick an item off the old bucket list. I'm not going to actually be speaking much.
Just here for the ride, aren't you?
I didn't put the slides together. Ben kindly put the slides together. He kindly put my name above it. But this is all his work, really. I just get to be the one to introduce him. I work for Sage as digital sales manager. In a kind of way, as the great philosophical works that we were talking about earlier, great philosophical treatise, Star Wars, told us there's a dark side and a light. I'm a sales manager, that's my dark side. But on the other side of it, the way I kind of get through the day and can sleep at night, I look after accessibility at Sage. And through that role, I actually met Ben and worked with him on the accessibility audit. And we just wanted to give you a kind of brief overview of what was actually happening with the audit and how it can make a difference, hopefully, to how you decide upon platforms that you work with, publishers that you work with, and provide content to your patrons and users that really makes a difference for them. So without further ado, or with some ado, I'd like to hand over to Ben.
Okay, thank you very much, Hugh. And Hugh's being way too humble. He's been an absolutely key part of what we've been doing, and I will do my best to whiz you through it now and talk to you about how it kind of came about and what the output has been and how we think people may find it helpful to use the audit outputs to understand more about the way that we do procurement, what we can realistically ask for from suppliers, and what we can look at in-house. You know, where are we possibly not maximising accessibility through some of the in-house practices that we're doing. So there's quite a lot of stuff that came out of the audit that we weren't expecting to find. The background was that I was the law librarian at Kent for a long time, and an opportunity to do a secondment came up looking at how we can make information more accessible at Kent. So the way I always describe this to people, it's the information equivalent of putting in ramps and lifts, okay? So we're saying most places we're kind of reasonably confident about access to physical spaces, but what about virtual access, and how do we measure that? How do we know that we're all on the same page on that one? And when you talk to perhaps one ebook supplier and they say, yeah, don't worry, we're accessible, does that mean the same as the next ebook supplier? And we certainly felt unsure about where those benchmarks were, even if there were any. And I think even the publishers, in talking to Huw, would say they're not so clear about those things either. So it was an effort for us all to try and refresh and understand what we mean when we say accessibility. What are the priorities and what do users want? Okay, so the audit itself tries to do that, tries to give some basic benchmarks to understand, well, when we say text-to-speech, this is what we mean. When we talk about magnification, this is how we mean it, and this is how we might go about measuring it. The some really lovely things came out of this. You know, this idea of trying to take very technical standards. So the one that people may be familiar with is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But that's a real piece of work. You know, it's almost, Huw and I were discussing this in the cab on the way over, that it's, I think it's written by developers for developers. It's not necessary for people like us at the coalface who just want to connect that student who's right in front of you with that resource in the way that works best for them. It's much more technical than that. So it's not really something very useful on the front line. So our idea was to try and create these everyday standards that we could all understand in order that we can then say to students, yeah, I know exactly what would be good for you. I know exactly how that might work. And I can show you how to switch that functionality on where we now know it exists. The team was Alistair McNaught from JISC, Huw from Sage, and then a raggle-taggle band of universities, mainly a nice mixture of library and disability. So I mentioned earlier that I got this secondment to look at accessible information, and one of the first things I was doing was trying to understand how alternative formats work. Because at Kent, we didn't really have something I felt was really, really robust. And I went to Leeds Beckett because there was some report the government produced about disabled students' allowance changes, which of course is one of the big drivers for this renewed interest in accessibility in HE. And Leeds Beckett the government said something very nice about the way they were doing alt formats. So I went to talk to Sue Smith at Leeds Beckett, and I was trying to understand the process because I was a law librarian, so I kind of knew something about reading lists and that process, but I didn't really understand the sort of accessibility impact and implications. So I was trying to scribble down my notes, and I said to Sue the very naive comment that, okay, so if we can get an electronic resource, we're sorted, right, and we can move on. And she said, well, it doesn't really work like that because it may be that the book isn't quite accessible for the particular needs of that student, or one supplier may be more accessible than another supplier. So where ebooks should be the answer, it didn't feel like they were reliably enough to make that a core part of our strategy for supplying alternative formats, which kind of got me thinking that doesn't feel right to me, you know. Right, let's just think about what an accessible format is, just so we are all on the same page. So what I mean by it is that it's something that should just work out of the box for people. If you think of Apple devices, that they're very nicely designed, and most people seem to be able to pick them up and reasonably intuitively get on with them. There shouldn't be any insurmountable barriers to stop you accessing that resource. So if we can get resources that allow, you know, that are unlocked and ready for people to dive straight into, to do whatever they wish to do with, that promotes their self-sufficiency, independent study, a lot of the things I think we saw mentioned in the TEF. And the nature of accessible resources and the ability to adapt them, reformat them, and tailor them to your own requirements typically means that the most accessible resources are electronic resources. So hence the focus on ebooks and other e-resources. So when we talk about why electronic resources may be best, there's a whole load of things. But you know, if we were talking about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, we're talking about hundreds of pages of very technical, but this is our sort of nuts and bolts, Ben's a librarian kind of view on the world. You should be able to magnify the text. So you can magnify it, so if you prefer to have it a little bit larger on the screen, you can do that, but crucially, the text should also reflow. So it doesn't just grow out of all proportion and then you lose all context of where you are on the page. As you magnify, the text should sort of reformat itself on the screen so that everything still fits, even though it's at a much larger scale. That's called responsive design, which is something that's very common in, you know, mobile phone accessible web pages. Changing background colours is something that's very useful, particularly for students with certain types of visual stress. You know, they may like to take a white background with black text and maybe invert that, or have a black background and yellow text to take some of the kind of glare away from the way that it's presented. If a resource isn't too heavily locked down by digital rights management, there's an opportunity even to convert completely from one format to another. So let's say the resource we were looking at was a PDF or a Adobe Digital Editions accessible document, you may wish to say, well, could I reformat that and have that as an MP3 so I could listen to that chapter, that lecture, that resource as I'm cycling into the university in the morning. So, and the final key thing is that the document should be easily navigable. If there's no clear points of navigation within a document, no headings, bookmarks in that way, then it's very difficult for someone using a screen reader, so someone who's not browsing visually, to know that chapter 25 is the one that they want to begin their looking at history of libraries. They might conceivably have to read a whole load of the previous chapters to realise that the one they want starts halfway through the book, which is, in terms of a usability experience, is a bit of a disaster. Okay, so where things aren't accessible, just people may be familiar with this type of technology. This is our kind of current coalface options. So you've got a video magnifier which will allow you to take a print resource, plonk it under this kind of monitor which has a camera pointing down, which then projects the image onto the monitor, which can then be magnified to quite a significant degree, and you can also do some level of screen masking, so you can change the background colors. But this isn't network, this is very local, so if I wanted to access this technology, then I have to physically make my way into the library to use it. And also, I'm very uncomfortable by assistive technology rooms or spaces, or you go to that bit of the library where the assistive technology is, because what if your mates are all sitting in beanbags and sipping lattes in the cafe, but you have to go to your bit over here? That doesn't feel terribly inclusive. So we want to move away from this kind of thing. So the more we can get resources that are available electronically and accessible electronically, the more we can move away from this kind of thing. I guess the next level up is optical character recognition, where if a resource isn't available in a ideally born digital electronic accessible format, then we may have to do some in-house creation of resources. So there's a print copy of a book here. Underneath the little thing that looks like an Anglepoise lamp towards the left-hand side is actually a scanner, which takes a picture of the page and instantly renders it in a machine-readable format. So the text that's on the monitor on the computer just to the right of it is now instantly being read aloud. Now that's useful for immediate kind of quick research kind of help, but that's not really ideal for someone who has got a lot of reading to do. That certainly isn't going to deal with some of those issues around navigation that we spoke about. It's certainly not going to provide alternative text for any images that are in that book. So how would I know if the next page that I scanned had a graph showing the GDP of Brazil for 2012? How would I know what that was? How would I know the context of that? And what's that telling me about the GDP of Brazil in 2012? So there's a lot of problems with kind of existing print resources. They're very, they're not quite as accessible as electronic resources, and they should be the answer, is kind of what we're saying. So the reason for this, it's the right thing to do. The Disabled Students Allowance has given us extra kind of ammunition to say, look, we've got to do this, This isn't optional. This isn't a kind of, oh, wouldn't it be nice? This is vital. You could argue we pay for this anyway. If we have paid the going rate for a commercial resource that isn't accessible to a reasonable number of our patrons, then that's not doing its job, and something's not right there in our procurement. We perhaps didn't make ourselves clear enough. And more than that, if the resource we've purchased isn't accessible, there are added costs then to the institution in terms of finding an alternative format. So some research by Andy McMahon at the University of University of Dundee, estimated that the costs of resourcing alternative formats could be as much as 96p per page. So imagine a 300-page textbook. I'm not expecting people to look at the detail of this, just get an idea of the chaos, the difficulty. this is the catalogue of interventions that has to happen if we cannot find an accessible born digital resource for someone who has a print disability. There's a whole load of things you might do of going to external agencies such as the Royal National Institute for the Blind. You may go to the publisher, you may end up having to do some of that in-house scanning. All of these things take a great deal of time, a lot of energy, a lot of resourcefulness, and very sadly often delay the immediacy of the student accessing the resource, which isn't right, isn't fair, and is certainly not a fluid distribution of our resources. So the ebook audit was designed to kind of look at all of these things and try and give us some tools to help address them. I should crack on with it, shouldn't I? Let me just tell you about how we did it, right? So there was a mailing list set up, a JISC mailing list, where we kind of got recruits. We kind of identified that there was a big community who would find this sort of work interesting. And we set up a mailing list, which is mainly library people, but an awful lot of disability people as well. And we kind of raised some awareness of what we were planning, which was to take a look at the current status of accessibility in a whole range of suppliers, publisher platforms and aggregator platforms. We asked that community, which had about 200 people on it, which platforms they felt were the big priorities, which ones, we couldn't necessarily do all of them, but which platforms should we look at to audit and understand more about those things we spoke about, text-to-speech, magnification. And then we created the audit set of questions, which, if I can I don't know if I can get on the internet here. If you Google ebook accessibility audit, you'll find the page. It'll be the first result. And just have a look at the various spreadsheets. I'll show you some screenshots of them in a moment. But you can then see exactly how we scored them, what the key criteria were. I mean, it was a bit more advanced than the 4 magnification reflow things I showed you earlier. Okay, the testing was done from that community. We basically crowdsourced responses. We created an audit form with a whole load of questions, and we said to people, look, we can't do this all on our own. It was those 5 institutions you saw earlier on who were doing the kind of driving. But this was all in addition to our day jobs. This wasn't a specific project that we'd been given or was funded, so we needed some help to do this. So we asked people to look at platforms they subscribe to and go through the list of questions and from a library user perspective, not a developer perspective, nothing too technical, just how do you do this? How are you experiencing this? Does it work with the tools that you have? Is the guidance clear on how you switch on any accessibility functionality? And a brilliant response from the community. We were able to get 33 universities submit some multiple audits. We covered 44 platforms, 65 publishers, and 280 ebooks. The benefits, I guess, of doing it are that academics could look at this, which effectively it looks like a league table. Although I should be clear that this isn't designed to beat publishers up. It is honestly meant as a tool to showcase where there may be problems and where things could be improved in the kind of supply chain to enhance development or focus development on things that users are telling us that they actually want and people are experiencing in everyday life, rather than these web content accessibility guidelines, which are way too technical and slightly abstract. Okay. One of the really interesting findings of doing this audit, when we got all the data back about, which platform did well in certain areas, and some did brilliantly in, say, text-to-speech, but didn't do so well in terms of magnification and reflow. But some of the kind of collateral discoveries we made were that actually it isn't necessarily clear where there may be a problem. So this slide shows the attrition rate. So what we mean is that a book in its raw form could actually be reasonably accessible, but by the time it goes through, it leaves the publisher and goes through an aggregator. If the aggregator do something different, they have a different approach to digital rights management, or their system perhaps isn't quite as slick as the original publisher platform. And then when we get to the institutional level, there could be something where we've got an out-of-date version of a particular piece of software that limits some of that accessibility potential. At every stage, we could be shredding otherwise good accessibility potential. So that's something to be aware of, that this isn't just a publisher thing where we can, kick publishers and say, this is an outrage. It could be at any stage along that journey. And this just gives a bit more detail on it, where you can see that it's not fair just to blame it all on the publisher, even though that's often what happens. But there are a whole load of opportunities for accessibility to not be optimized, let's say that. Okay, this is interesting. I think another interesting finding, I'm sorry it's quite small, but I'll give you the essence of it. This is the same book on a in-house platform, so a Cambridge University Press title that scored 62%, and then through an aggregator, the same title gets 36%. I hope that's too small for people to read who that aggregator was. But you get the idea how there can be difference, and that you think, well, so which one do we use? How do we understand what's going on there? And isn't that useful intelligence for the aggregator to know about, and certainly for the publisher to say, look, hang on a second, we're giving you these books in a certain state, and they're not ending up in that state. So can we have a conversation about that? So there's a whole load of drivers and a whole load of people along the way who can just raise their awareness through something like this, and understand a bit more about some really quick wins that we can all make. For example, like just offering a range of different formats can unlock accessibility potential for a whole load of different people. So it could be that the PDF version is great for some people because that allows certain functionality. The EPUB 3 would probably be the optimal download format. But the opportunity to have a range of formats actually impacts the accessibility potential of the resource as well. So that's something to bear in mind when you're doing procurement. And I guess for us, or for librarians, the ultimate aim of this is to be able to use this to help guide your own procurement, to say, right, we've got a meeting coming up with X publisher or X aggregator. Let's have a look at how they're kind of performing in terms of accessibility, and can we make this something that gives them a business incentive to do better on it? So I'll just show you this is just the original audit form and some of the sorts of questions that we were asking our non-technical, remember, everyday library people to do the testing. And I think that was the really nice thing about this survey. It wasn't done by people, who are hidden away in some server room. This was done by people who weren't confident in accessibility. So if they couldn't understand what accessibility was and how to switch on the functionality and use the assistive technology, then how could you support users to do that? And one of the really lovely outcomes was that the people who did the audit for us said that their confidence in terms of supporting people around accessibility improved immeasurably just by doing the survey, just because it opened their eyes to so many of the challenges to how people have to overcome barriers to access very simple everyday information. So that would be something, part of CPD potentially, to say to people, well, we could ask new members of library staff to audit one platform, as part of their appraisal, cycle. So this is just saying things about navigation, which we mentioned, text-to-speech. So this is where obviously the computer is able to interact with the text in a way that can then read it aloud, so that students who are accessing it non-visually can hear it, but also all of us who may think, well, sometimes I don't like sitting at a monitor like this and staring at a textbook for 8 hours. I'd like it in a different format, or I'd like to listen to it while I'm laying in my bed, and relaxing. Then it's a different way of accessing material. Okay, I think, yeah, this was a really interesting one, actually. Sorry, we asked if there were accessibility guides for people using the pages, and often there were, but they were so well hidden, or you may have had accessibility functionality that it was there all along, but you had to kind of know the sort of secret handshake to be able to switch it on. And probably one of the key things to remember about accessibility and inclusivity kind of functionality is that it doesn't just work for people who have print disabilities. Generally it makes it better for everyone. Everyone would find it a better experience where it's an accessible thing. So why not just switch that on by default? Why does that have to be hidden in some, secret handshake kind of thing? So I think that was useful intelligence for suppliers as well. In the future, we would like this to become more part of, embedded into procurement and consortia purchasing cycles. We want to make this something that matters in terms of procurement. We want it to mean something in terms of giving people a business incentive to change practice and to embed this stuff and to make it cost effective for them to do so. There's that statistic. Over 90% of our first-time testers felt better equipped to advise disabled readers as a result of doing the survey. I don't know if people have seen this before, but Michael Moore, when he published Stupid White Men, he originally had 50,000 copies that were about to be pulped because HarperCollins were concerned that it was a bit too critical of the Bush administration. And he mentioned this at a union conference, I think, and a librarian happened to be in the audience, and she put this on a mailing list, and I think this is an outrage, this shouldn't be allowed. And then a few days later, the librarians started picketing HarperCollins in Manhattan, and the end result was that they agreed to let it go in its original format, and the librarians won. And Michael Moore now says that librarians are the most dangerous people in society. And he funds lots of scholarships for library schools and stuff like that. So we really we got to him. But I guess the message is that it's up to us. If we don't ask for this stuff, we don't create a demand for it, then that doesn't give that business incentive to make these changes, which, again, Huw and I were talking about this, these changes are difficult. It's very, very difficult for someone to just say, right, okay, don't worry, we'll go through every single textbook and we'll make all of our images available to people who can't see them. That's a real piece of work. It's a science, and it's very, very expensive to do that. But if we don't do that, who ends up doing it? Possibly us at the last minute when a student presents to you, say, look, I've got my seminar tomorrow, but I'm really struggling with these graphs in chapter 3. How can I get access to them? So something has to change, and I think we are well placed to create that demand and say what I think is something that should be there all along, really, which is that the books we're buying are accessible to all of our users. Okay, this is an example of one of the kind of individual platform feedback scores that you can see. So there's one for each of the platforms that we looked at, and you can see how many audits were done. So it might be that some platforms were audited multiple times, and then the score that they got, and then an explanation of what it all means, all right? So it's not just a random score. It then says that, this is because of these things, and it's meant to be a sort of toolkit for change for the supplier, but also for us as in doing procurement to say, well, hang on a second, what's the plan here? How are you addressing some of these types of concerns around accessibility? Because remember, if they don't, then you may have to. And I'm very pleased to say that there's been some wonderful positive reaction from publishers and aggregators. Dawson's are doing a lovely piece of work at the moment to kind of review this and undertake their own audit of their platform. VLE Books have changed their accessibility statement to correspond with some of the key questions from the ebook audit, so that, again, we're all on the same page. And when we say accessibility, we kind of all know what that means and what the boundaries of that are. If you would like to be involved, there's lots of people saying to us, well, you really should do this again. And it was quite a piece of work. And I used to have a home life. But I think we will do it again, because I think it's important to celebrate where people have improved. So I think there has been some really lovely engagement. And if we did it again and we could show that, this supplier was down here, but now they're kind of over here, that's a really great thing, and that's something that we should celebrate. And then perhaps suppliers can see how other suppliers are doing and talk to them about how they improved, because I think this is in everyone's interest. Nobody, this isn't really something that we can be in competition about. I mean, I think everyone wants everyone to have access to things to reach their potential. So if you'd like to be involved, join the LIS Accessibility mailing list in particular, and watch out for the kind of next call for recruits. If you'd like any information about the audit, how you might use it in your procurement, help to understand some of the rather clever spreadsheets that have been produced from it, then contact us on ebookaudithelp@gmail.com. I think that's it. Have you got anything to add, Huw?
I would just say, I know conscious of time, be that dangerous librarian. Tell us what we need to do to improve. This is a free service. You can just go to this website and look at the reports and the scores for all the publishers and the platforms. Use it to kind of make the experience better for your customers, but also tell us feedback, what we've got wrong with our platforms, because it's the only way we'll learn. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.